Well, good afternoon and welcome. I'm delighted that you all have joined us for this second event of Central Seminary's Inauguration Week. Last night, we were gifted to hear an excellent lecture by Dr. Frank Yamada, Executive Director of the Association of Theological Schools. And today, we gather to spend time in discussion with an esteemed panel of theological educators. Our topic for today is ministry and faith leadership in an ever-changing religious landscape. And for those of us whose calling and service is centered around the academy, this is a topic of frequent, if not daily, conversation. We give much time to identifying the rapid changes that are happening in our culture and in our faith communities. And we seek to address those changes and adapt as we can so that we can provide better and relevant theological education for our students as they learn together, both in our seminaries and in our institutes. So in my last 7 months as president of Central Seminary, I found myself involved in internal and external conversations about the ever-changing religious landscape and about how we can rethink theological education based on those changes. And some days it seems to dominate every discussion that I'm in, every meeting that I attend, and every article that I read. On December 23rd, I was looking at Christian Century Online and ran across an article that was posted that day, written by Dr. Justo Gonzalez. So 2 days before Christmas, this was still the topic, the religious landscape changes and rethinking theological education. Dr. Gonzalez's article was part of a series on how I've changed my mind. And here's some of the things that he writes. He said, perhaps the most significant change of my mind and heart in recent years has to do with how we define and talk about theological education. Theological education is not limited to the preparation of pastors and other leaders for the church. It's a continuum that begins in the catechism class and in Sunday school and continues throughout the life of every believer, supported and reinforced in worship. This continuum includes, but is not restricted to, particular forms of training for those who are called to lead the church and pastoral and other functions. And then he says, this widening scope has led me to reconsider the entire enterprise of theological education. And then he talks about his own shift in use of metaphors when he thinks about theological education. He writes, back in the 1980s and 1990s, when we were seeking ways to promote the presence of Latinos and Latinas in the higher echelons of theological education, we used to speak of developing a pipeline. This pipeline was intended to carry prospective scholars in religion from high school through college, through seminary, eventually through a doctoral program and into a teaching position. And the purpose of the pipeline was to carry its contents to their final destination with every single drop in that pipeline. If it did not reach its final destination, it was considered a loss that must be prevented. And then Gonzalez says he's come to a better place with a metaphor for this season of life in theological education. Instead of thinking solely about a pipeline, he thinks now about irrigation, an irrigation hose. And he says the purpose of an irrigation hose is not to make certain that every drop reaches the end of the line, but rather to see that every drop that runs through finds its proper function, irrigating the land around it. And then these are his conclusions. The primary purpose of theological education is to help each believer irrigate the land where she or he happens to be. Those who do not go beyond Sunday school, if they irrigate the land around them, they are just as valuable as those who teach in a seminary or school of theology. And those who teach in such institutions are valued on the basis of how well they irrigate the land in which they have been placed. This shift in metaphors has had a dramatic consequences for the way that we should do theological education from the local church to graduate school. So today we gather around with this group of panelists who will help us rethink theological education in light of the ever-changing landscape that we live in. I'd like to introduce our panelists to you now. We have three. Dr. Ryan Bolger is Associate Professor of Church and Contemporary Culture at the School of Intercultural Studies of Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California. He joined the Fuller faculty in 2002 and teaches classes on missiology, technological culture, church and mission, church planting, church renewal, and he also mentors PhD, DMin, and DMiss doctoral students in the areas of contemporary culture in the church. He's an active researcher in the areas of church and contemporary culture, and he has done some studies and research and writing around spiritual communities in a technological world. He is the author and editor of Gospel After Christendom, New Voices, New Cultures, and New Expressions, and the co-author of Emerging Churches, Creating Christian Communities in the Postmodern Culture. Dr. Bolger was a guest here at Central some 5-6 years ago on our campus and now joins us on Zoom. So we're glad to welcome him back to this conversation today. Dr. Charisse Gillett is president of Lexington Theological Seminary. It's a Disciples of Christ Seminary in Lexington, Kentucky. She served in that role since 2011 and is the first African-American and first woman to hold the position of president in the 155-year history of that institution. And prior to serving at Lexington, Dr. Gillett held leadership positions at Transylvania University, Midway College, Robert Morris College, and the University of Northern Iowa. She earned her doctoral degree in education from Northern Illinois University and has undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University of Northern Iowa. And she is commissioned by the Christian Church in Kentucky and serves as associate minister at East 2nd Street Christian Church. And so we welcome you today, Dr. Gillett. And our third panelist is Dr. Nora Lozano. She is professor of theological studies at the Baptist University of the Americas in San Antonio, Texas. Her academic interests are centered in the areas of systematic, Hispanic, Latin American, and women's theologies, as well as leadership studies. Dr. Lozano is also executive director and co-founder of the Christian Latina Leadership Institute, which is an institute that is devoted to discovery, development, and nurturance and empowerment of women leaders from a Latina perspective, so that they might be transformative agents in the church and in the community. Dr. Lozano earned her PhD and her Master of Philosophy in Religious and Theological Studies at Drew University, and her MDiv from Eastern Baptist Theological Seminary, which is now Parker Seminary, and her BA in Social Communication from the University in Monterrey, Mexico. And so we welcome you, Dr. Lozano. I have asked each of these three panelists if they would share for a few minutes, 5 to 7 minutes, about their context in which they are providing theological education and now in 2021, and tell us a little bit about what that looks like for them as they are providing services and resources for students in their areas. So let's start with you, Dr. Lozano. I have to take a point of privilege. Nora and I have been longtime friends, and I am so grateful that she has joined us. And I am a huge fan of the Christian Latina Leadership Institute, which she leads. So Nora, tell us some about your work there.
Thank you. Thank you. First, I want to thank you, Dr. Dorso, for the invitation to participate in this panel. It is really an honor to be here with you and these distinguished colleagues. Also, I want to congratulate you on this important occasion of your inauguration as president of Central Baptist Theological Seminary. I'm very proud of you and all of your achievements, and I'm looking forward to see the great things that you're going to do in the future. Now to your question. I have been involved in theological education for 25 years. My current positions, as you mentioned, are Professor of Theological Studies at the Baptist University of the Americas in San Antonio, and Executive Director of the Christian Latina Leadership Institute I have served at the university for 20 years and at the Institute for 15 years. And both of these places are predominantly Latino institutions. The university grants undergraduate degrees. It offers a multicultural education with some emphasis on Latino perspectives, and 80% of the student body is formed by Latinos and Latinas. The Christian Latina Leadership Institute, CLLI for short, offers a certificate in Latina leadership studies. Originally, the CLLI was an institute that was part of the university. In fact, it started just as a generic class, and it continued to grow. And now it's a 501c3 organization registered in the state of Texas. The institute has sites in North Carolina, Central Texas, East Texas, as well as in Metepec, Mexico, which is a little city 1 hour from Mexico City, and in Monterrey, Mexico. And the work of the Institute, as you mentioned, is devoted to the discovery, development, nurturance, and empowerment of women leaders from a Latina perspective, to be transformational agents in church and community settings. Now, the classes of the Institute are offered from the Latina Christian perspective and open to all Christian women, Latinas and Latinas at heart. So we have all kind of different women coming from different countries, from different ethnic groups, and we're just delighted to have all these women working together to develop their leadership skills and to grow. The graduates of the university are serving in all areas of ministry, and I refer to ministry in a broad sense here. So they serve in churches as pastors, staff members in nonprofit organizations, social work, education, and other fields. Now, let me mention also that they are serving by going to study at graduate schools and seminaries. Now, someone may say, well, they're not serving yet, they're studying. While it is true that they're studying, they are also serving the community as role models. The next generations of Latinos and Latinas are observing them, and they are saying, oh, if so-and-so, or if this brother or this sister was able to go to graduate school, perhaps I can make it also, perhaps I can go there too. So they fulfill an important role in talking about changes. As you were saying, when I started at the university 20 years ago, the school was not accredited, so pretty much 0 students were going to master's programs. But now we have more than 36 to 40% going to graduate school after they have been with us at BUA. Now, regarding the CLLI graduates, they serve in all fields of ministry and work. The CLLI is open to any Christian woman who wants to improve her leadership skills. Now, the CLLI does not prepare women for a particular area of service, but helps women to identify their calling and helps them to develop leadership skills through a holistic education that involves all the areas of their lives. In short, through the CLLI training, they experience empowerment and transformation. So these women serve in all areas of ministry as well as in many professional fields and jobs. Of course, they also serve as role models in the community, role models that provide hope to the next generation as they help this next generation to open their eyes and imagination to a wider, better future. Thank you.
So that's my new tagline for, this season. You were on mute, so I was muted myself. Dr. Gillett, would you like to tell us about Lexington Theological Seminary and your context of providing education there?
Thank you. It's good to be with the panel, and I thank you, Madam President, for the invitation to share here with you today. Blessings on your ministry and the task and joy ahead of you. Lexington Theological Seminary is a covenant seminary of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. We think of ourselves and believe that ecumenism is a part of who we are in terms of our theological perspective. We have a 155-year-old seminary born at the end of the Civil War. And I think that's a critical piece of how we understand ourselves. An institution born after one of the worst conflicts in our history is still standing. And so ask me some other time when I talk about what I think about this. People don't trust institutions. There's some more conversation there. But our students are primarily students who are seeking to become ministers, congregational ministers in particular. There was a point in our history where we prepared students for pretty much any kind of ministry. But through our reinvention process, we realized that what we do best and what the church and the denominations that we serve want us to do is to prepare pastors for congregational ministry. And so 99% of our students come here with that intent. They are enrolled in Masters of Divinity programs, the DMin program, and MA. Many of them are enrolled in continuing education programs to strengthen their understanding of theology and pastoral ministry. And we have a Master's of Theological Studies, which is directed towards students who are of the Catholic tradition. Our average age is 55. Our students are located in 26 states across the country, and we're evenly made up of both men and women students. Part of how we see ministry at LTS is that when you're preparing pastors for ministry, one of the best places to do that is in a congregational setting. So our classroom is a physical classroom, it's an online classroom, and it's in the congregation. Every student enrolled at LTS has what we call an accountable ministry site. And they are in that accountable ministry site from the beginning of their degree to the end of their degree. So it's more of a journeying with a congregation and a journeying with a student as we move through their Masters of Divinity or their DMin program. We do that because in our research about 10 years ago, and when you use the word research and 10 years ago, it's like, is that even valid? But it still is true. We learned that what congregations were saying to us is that, you know, you're preparing people who can preach a really great sermon on Sunday morning, but the church is the church 7 days a week. And we need people who understand how the church operates as an organization, as a theological community, and as a community of faith. And so because of that, we believe that working in a church, an accountable ministry site, with lay leaders and members of the community gives our students the best opportunity to leave us well prepared for ministry. One of the things that we're doing right now is thinking very carefully about what kind of opportunity is available to students when they leave here. At one point, there may have been an idea that students would graduate, become a solo pastor at a church, and that's where they would live the rest of their ministry life. Well, we found that that is not true. What we know to be true is that many of our students are cycling in a church. They're there for 5 to 7 years, and then they're leaving. We have found that many of our students are bivocational. They have a secular job, and they have a congregation that they serve. Many of them are serving churches which have anywhere from 50 to 100 people. And at the same time, we have students who leave us and they become members of a multi-staff church. So what we're trying to prepare students for is the church of the future. So there's a church that exists today, and then there's a church that will exist tomorrow. So we're conducting what we think is pretty relevant research on what it means to be a bivocational clergy person, what it means to minister in a rural context, and what it means to administer or be a pastor in an urban context or an ethnic context. Finally, the one thing I will say is that we are discovering that, and this is no surprise to anyone, that the church is deeply, deeply divided. And more so than anything, these last 4 years in a social, political, cultural context where, let's say, wearing a mask is not a health issue, but a political issue, and then becomes a religious issue. We find congregations, pastors are having difficulty preaching and teaching in a church where every word can be misunderstood as a political action. We have a faculty member here, Dr. Leah Shade, who has been teaching what we call preaching in the purple zone. So how do you preach to a congregation where on one hand, at the end of service, someone could be clapping and saying, wonderful, I love that sermon. And then on the other hand, someone says, you were attacking me. How do you create a space in a congregation that is deeply divided around social, political, cultural lines and create a theological space, a space for conversations about what it means to be faithful, what it means for us to serve God, what it means for us to deliver the good news? That's one of the pieces that we're dealing with right here. The third piece that I think reflects some of the work that we're doing right now is how do we help congregations thrive? LTS received 2 Lilly grants. One's a Thriving in Ministry grant, one's a Thriving Congregations Initiative. And through both of those grants, we're working with a group of congregations and pastors and lay leaders to say, what is your ministry? What is God calling your church to do at this time in this season of in this time and in this season? And what are the gifts or resources you have in your congregation to do that? So I think that we are, as a part of our reinvention process, we are thinking that church, congregations, people called to serve these congregations could be anyone. And our role and our job as a faithful institution that's been here for 155 years is to provide them with the tools to do that and to do that faithfully. I think I'll stop there.
I want to come back to that reinvention phrase that you keep using, but we'll come back to that later maybe. Dr. Bolger, would you tell us a little bit about your context at Fuller and what that looks like for you and your students?
I would love to. Thank you. And thank you. I'm honored to be a part of this panel and on this momentous week. And so I'm grateful to be here and be amongst my colleagues here. So yeah, I've had the opportunity to serve at Fuller Seminary for the last 18 years. And Fuller Theological Seminary, it goes back to that movement in American religion in the 40s, where there was sort of a movement of renewal post-war. This was the era of Billy Graham and Bill Bright and Campus Crusade and InterVarsity and Wheaton College and Christianity Today, the magazine. And there was a radio evangelist, Charles E. Fuller. And this evangelist generated and created and facilitated the building of a school, Fuller Seminary. And from the outset, it really, in that renewal movement, it sought to be part of that renewal movement space, which was trying to make a third space between fundamentalism and liberalism. Fundamentalism, be fundamentalist, not fundamentalist, but be conservative in convictions and theology, but very engaged in culture and in life, social life. And so that was part of the initial sorts of groundbreaking of the seminary. Also, there wasn't that many seminaries in Southern California at the time. And so it really sought to sort of serve this area. It was non-denominational from the start, although it definitely had a strong Presbyterian feel with many of the early professors and leaders. Over time, they've started 3 different schools here: a school of theology, a school of psychology, and a school of world mission. And with leaders in all those areas, and really looking to create real scholarship in those 3 areas. And so the School of Theology was created in the 40s, the School of World Mission and Psychology in 1965. And to this day, we train psychologists, marriage and family therapists, pastors of all types, and serving in all types of ministries, and missionaries, nonprofit leaders, those serving in many, many different contexts around the world. And so we have quite an international student body. We're multi-denominational, so we'll have over 80 different denominations, and that sort of passion for Christ at the center, and yet sort of centers our seminary, but one can come with living out that passion for many, many different denominations. And so that's how that's what brings us together. Over the years, we made some pretty big set down some pretty big perspectives on how we were going to live out our evangelicalism. And one in the 70s was around women in ministry. And so for an evangelical institution to ordain women in ministry was not the norm at that point. And so that set us apart in a significant way, I would say, in that generation. One of the things that I was a part of, when I was hired, is I was hired to be the first online professor and start the first online degree. And so we started the first online theological degree in the United States. And so I was part of that in 2002, getting that going. And that online degree has continued to grow to this day as well. And so that even broadened the kind of students that we're training and the places they're coming from across the world. So Pasadena has been our main hub for many years, but what we're really looking to do, and maybe part of the discussion going forward, is really to be serving people in their context so that they don't need to leave anymore, and they can serve in their congregations as we mentor and teach them. One of the things that has been a focus over the last few years at Fuller was on vocation and call. We realized that one size didn't fit all in our classrooms, that we may be teaching a particular New Testament 1, New Testament 2, or whatever, but that what really is important for the student is that student called to a life in film, or a life serving a congregation, or a life as a trafficking advocate in Southeast Asia, or, so where they're ending up may determine what they appropriate from each of the classes we teach. And so we put 4 classes at the core of the curriculum across all the master's degrees, and we do masters and MDivs and PhDs in all 3 schools. But we put across the schools classes on discerning your vocation, and discerning your vocation in terms of who you are, and then who you are in relationship to God, to the community, and to the world. And so around mission, around community, and around worship. And so we put that at the core of the curriculum so that each person would be able then to build on that self-understanding and know how to appropriate which classes to take, but even which kind of projects to take on in each class. And so that has been an effort really for us for about the last 7 years, is really putting vocation and call, which was really incidental and assumed before then. We thought that was the congregation's work, and we weren't going to further that conversation at all. But we realized our students weren't coming with that. And so that is something that we've done the last few years that's definitely sort of changed the fabric of our institution. So I'll stop there because I know there's other questions we want to engage, but that's a good introduction, I think.
Hearing these 3 different narratives about your places of leadership and education reflects exactly what Dr. Yamada said last night, is there's great diversity, beautiful diversity among the theological schools in which we all are serving. And therefore we have to, to be true to that and to continue to learn and to grow and be the best and what we are doing. So one of the questions that I had sent to the panelists earlier was to talk about where they saw changes coming on the religious landscape pre-COVID. What were you thinking in early 2020 about how the religious life would unfold in this country in the next few years? And I know that has shifted, but I'm just kind of wanting to go back and think, where were we before this pandemic invaded our lives, and what were we thinking? And I would open it up to any of the three of you if you want to unmute yourselves and let kind of answer and maybe have some dialogue around where we were about a year ago and our thinking about the religious landscape.
I think I can start, if that's okay.
Yes.
I thought a lot about this question. In fact, for me, it was the hardest question of the ones that we receive, because there's always a possibility of answering with the declining church or with the struggles, but I tend to be on the positive side. So I answer it in that way, with that tone. So as a theological educator, I can say that I am a dreamer. And I'm a dreamer in the sense that I dream about transform people, transform churches, transform societies. However, I not only dream about this transformation, but I move forward. And I try to do my small part in making these dreams a reality. Furthermore, as a Christian theological educator, I think if you are in theological education, you have to have a lot of hope for the future. So now I am a theological educator who serves predominantly in Latino institutions. So the religious landscape that I want to refer to in this particular question is the general Hispanic Latino religious landscape, and particularly the one in the south of the United States where I live and serve. Now I recognize that this background may be similar to other ones in the rest of the country, but given this personal background as a dreamer in particular religious landscape at the beginning of 2020, I was anticipating, hoping that the Hispanic Latino religious landscape would change even a little to a theological perspective that pays more attention both in thought and action to the concrete oppressive situations that our communities are facing, for instance, such as issues of racism and sexism. Of course, I see that change will emanate from a more holistic reading of the gospel. Many times our biblical readings are not the best ones, especially, we know that as women, that's many times the Bible is used against women. So a reading that involves spiritual realities, but also concrete social realities. A reading that would challenge spiritualized, individualistic, private, heavenly centered perspectives of the Christian life and commitments. Yeah, and I anticipated that this reading, again, even if it brings a little change, will make the Christian message more relevant for young people and for women that sometimes are disappointed with what they see in the churches, and that these readings, will make them, make the church more relevant as these groups, young people and women and others are trying to build and live in a more inclusive world. So how does the church and how in the religious landscape we move towards that direction?
I might go next. There are a couple of things that I thought about, and it was really hard to go back and say pre-COVID. I had to remember that.
Yeah.
Because it's so consumed with COVID. But part of what I was thinking pre-COVID in terms of the work that the seminary is doing and the work that awaited our graduates, and our graduates are in urban, rural, kind of suburban, they're in congregations all over the country and in communities all over the country. And so part of what I was thinking then and thinking now is, how do we prepare our students for congregations that in my estimation are becoming, I don't want to say hostile to the gospel, but congregations that are leveraging the institution of church for other reasons. So in the African-American tradition, we're accustomed to the congregation being a place of advocacy. We're going to advocate for issues of race, justice, and equity. We're going to fight for those issues. In other churches, that same kind of energy I felt was coming to the fore, where the congregations were beginning to say, what is our responsibility to the gospel and to our fellow man? And so to begin to see their roles in what others may have previously thought of as the role of a nonprofit. But the role of the church is to advocate for justice and equality and for the whole church. And so I really felt like there was some energy moving towards that, that kind of church. And so that's the first thing. The second thing was the church becoming hostile to conversations about how faith should inform our decision-making and our living and our work and ministry in a way that made it almost impossible to have faithful conversations, because they ended up in such difficult, it made the table difficult. And how do we prepare students for that difficulty in ministry? Prepare them for those conversations, help their church get ready for those conversations, recognizing that many of our students facing some of these issues could be unemployed. If the church doesn't want to talk about these issues, if the church doesn't want to engage these issues, if this is not what your congregation wants to do, then many folks could find themselves seeking another congregation. So how do we get people ready for that? The third thing is how to make these issues understandable to communities that may not be engaged in them. For example, the whole issue of climate change, and why is that something the church should be concerned about? And why is it not just a conversation in a privileged setting, but why should people through all cultures and all communities talk about what the earth gives to us and how we treat the earth in return? It's God's creation. And then the fourth thing, of course, as an administrator, as president, I'm always thinking about is what is it that we should be doing as an institution to ensure, A, that the institution is here for the next generation of clergy and lay leaders, that the institution is here for the next iteration of the church, and how can we recognize that opportunity when the opportunity presents itself to us? So those were my pre-COVID thoughts. And indeed, we were preparing to enter a strategic planning process pre-COVID. And I'm happy to tell you about what happened after that. But I feel like we were really in a good place to have those kinds of conversations about what's next. What do our students need? How do we take the conversations we're having about race, gender, climate, resources, really, and help our students deal with those more effectively in their church from a faith perspective? So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I would say I resonate with what was already shared. There were some synchronicities there. One area that we were wondering a lot about was just the fact that millennials and the millennial generation is now between the ages of 25 and now 40, and their practice of spirituality in the United States is different than many of our professors and who've gone before. And so understanding how they do church and spirituality, we realize that we may not be training millennial Christian leaders in the ways that they need, in the ways that they are leading others spiritually. And one of the big issues for many in millennial spirituality is that they cobble their spirituality together from many, many different sources and don't necessarily rely on a single congregation for their care. And so they may have a group here, they may go on a mission trip here, they may have a support group here, they may listen to these particular people for preaching and for, and so there's a very eclectic sort of spirituality that's there. And so how do we come alongside the reality that many millennial Christian leaders are not in formal congregations? And how is it that we could maybe teach in such a way that puts practices at the center as opposed to dogma, in the sense that that the culture itself is looking for practices that are ready at hand to help us relax, help us engage, help us think differently, eat differently, serve differently. And so how do we train leaders in such a way that are very practice-based and don't just seem aloof from the everyday needs of their neighbors and friends? And so that caused us to be engaging some of those conversations. What it did was it did expand to some of the issues that Charisse was talking about in terms of climate change, in terms of race, in terms of perspectives on gender and other sorts of practices within contemporary culture that we just did not address front and center in our seminary. And we, in many ways, issues of science, things that were everyday sort of spiritual concerns for millennials, we were pretty silent on in training. And so how could we overcome that deficit and actually truly train millennial leaders in ways that are really helpful for them in new religious sorts of dynamics, in new, the people today are very conversant with those of other faiths and maybe even have taken on different practices from other faiths as part of their overall Christian spirituality. How do we interact with all that? We were not really set up for that. And so this is where, for us, we felt helped by our three-school perspective, because the School of World Mission, which became the School of Intercultural Studies, really helps with that sort of serving as dialogue partners with other religions and being able to mine the gold from here and from there. And so teaching our students to be able to walk with others was a big thing. We couldn't assume they were in just sort of a Christian bubble and we just had to keep bringing Christians to church. We really needed to help them live everyday Christian lives in the world. And so that was part of our, and we were moving towards a strategic plan. This was part of our effort to move forward, realizing that we couldn't just do it the way we did it in the 1950s or 60s or 70s.
I wanted to pause here and just say to those who are on Facebook Live or on our Zoom call, if you have questions that you would like to pose during this period, if you would type those into the chat or into the comment section, and I will read those and get those to our panelists as they come in. But I just wanted to welcome you to be a part of this conversation with your questions. And I did not say that earlier, but feel free to join in on this conversation with questions. And another question that I think has been sitting with me pretty heavily is, I came into this position in June, right in the middle of this pandemic, and did not therefore have any kind of history or experience with Central or in leading a seminary. And so it was this huge learning curve of learning structures and systems within, but doing that in a really kind of siloed way because, I'm in this building with a very few of our faculty and staff and have met most of the others on Zoom. And it's just been really a unique time for me to learn how to do this and how to be a president. But I'm wondering, I've watched as Central has adapted to the pandemic and used this season for learning and for good. And I'm wondering, in your context, what are the ways that your seminaries and organizations have adapted to meet the challenges that we faced in 2020, both with COVID-19 and with the racial unrest and resulting protests and the political unrest? What are some of the things that your seminary has done to manage and to stay sane and to help your students still be faithful in studying and learning and growing in this really difficult, hard season of life?
If I might go ahead. I'm chuckling because when I started at LTS, we had just declared financial exigency. And so, while I don't think they're quite the same thing, I had a laundry list of things. I'm like, oh, what do we do now? And so while there's no rule book for leading and starting a leadership role in the middle of a global pandemic, I find that for what we do here and did here at LTS in the midst of this is we focused on our mission and our students. And so our mission is to prepare faithful leaders to lead the church. And in the middle of a pandemic, what we discovered was that while we had fairly robust policies related to online education, because we had been doing it for so long, what we really needed to do was to step back and think about, for our students who are working in a congregation, leading a congregation, completing coursework, classwork, suddenly they are now homeschooling their students who are no longer, their children who are no longer going to public school. Suddenly they are now caregivers to a mom or dad, or concerned about that because they can't see them anymore. Suddenly they may have a partner or spouse who has lost their job. So what we found was that while we could focus on our mission, what we really needed to do is ask our students, how are you? What can we do for you? How can we help you? We needed to create space where students could share their common experience of being leaders in a pandemic. And so remember, as you lead, you still have a family, you still have obligations, you still have all of these things that you must do as well. And so we really tried to, we did the traditional things of modifying academic policy, taking a look at what our remote learning practices were for faculty and staff. They used our policies to help modify assignments. We did all of those things. But the piece that really, I think, helped our students and our community as a whole was we created space for conversation. And then we asked our community to resource itself, to write and provide what we call soul care messages to one another, to provide, 100, 200, 300 word missive that we would send out once a week. And if it wasn't something you wrote, but it was a picture you wanted to share that you had taken, or if it was a poem, we would send those soul care messages out once a week so that people could remember that they were connected to a faith community, and connected to a faith community that understood their unique circumstances of leading in a congregation while also handling the traditional family responsibilities. Dealing with the racial unrest was much more complicated for us. We're in Lexington, Kentucky. So Breonna Taylor died an hour and 15 minutes from where we live. So there was massive concern in our community about, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to say? Same thing with the George Floyd situation. Can you help me? It was a really, really hard time. We don't have a lot of students of color in our community. And we have a faculty and staff who were really grappling with this. So there are two things that really hung together for us. One, as a president and an African-American woman, I just was very candid that the moment we found ourselves in related to this racial reckoning was just wearing on me. It wasn't these weren't academic conversations for me. And I'm living this experience as a person of color, as a woman of color who's seen this kind of behavior over and over again. And I think I said to one group of people, I said, we need to ask ourselves why America needs an Emmett Till every 30, 60, 90 days in order to do what is right, to do what is faithful. So that we're still working on that one. What we did for our community to kind of create space is the Christian Church Disciples of Christ has a reconciliation ministry. And so we invited our reconciliation minister into our space and hosted a conversation. The rocks are crying out. And we talked to each other and we listened to each other. And we just simply said again and again, racism is a theological evil. It is a theological evil which has political, social, economic consequences for people who are living in this world. And we must do something. What that something is, our challenge to everyone was to, in your context, what do you do? But there are also larger pieces that we can do, and we shared some documents from the ATS, African American Deans and Presidents letter, which has concrete steps in it. So these things have been hard. COVID, a racial reckoning, and the third one, of course, is an economic devastation that's facing some congregations, not all, but some. And so we go back to trying to be very clear that we are going to help our students lead their churches, and we are going to help one another by demonstrating love and compassion and deep understanding for where people find themselves. In some ways, I found my response to be imperfect, especially with the racial reckoning, and I'm not quite sure how we move forward in that regard, because we've been here before and we will be here again. And so more outcry, more outrage is not necessarily what we need and what institutions need. We need people to do what the gospel has called them to do. And so getting to that point, I think, will be harder. So I think I'll stop there.
Yeah.
I can continue if it's okay. Here I will refer more to the work of the Christian Latina Leadership Institute. During the pandemic, what I noticed and read of the different groups that I belong to of nonprofit organizations, and some churches too, they opted for whatever reason for a more passive position. I heard over and over again, there's a pandemic, we cannot do much, let's wait until the pandemic is over to continue with our mission. Pre-COVID, all our trainings were face-to-face, always. And the board had discussed before online classes, but they were never approved. And because we wanted to maintain the warmth of the face-to-face classes, the interaction, the support, the networking. But then COVID came. And thankfully, and after much planning and work, we were able to move all of our trainings to virtual platforms. It took much work because many of our students are middle-aged women who come from economic challenge situations. Thus, they did not have access to technology or they didn't know how to use it. Thus, it took a significant amount of work to train these women who sometimes are in remote areas to learn how to take online and virtual classes. Also, we had to train our faculty to teach in these new platforms. Now, as I was saying, the CLLI trainings are characterized by face-to-face education that is warm, personal. And before COVID, as I was saying, all our trainings were face-to-face. But the students were so eager to continue learning. I remember when we told them that we were going to postpone our trainings in June, they were disappointed. So we started to work with them, we started to train them, and they continued. They were so eager to continue learning during the pandemic that they strongly supported this initiative of remote education. They were so excited with the idea of continuing with this leadership education. For instance, I remember clearly one of the students back in October. She was taking her classes connected to oxygen, basically. She contracted COVID and was at the hospital for several weeks. She had been released from the hospital just 2 or 3 days before the scheduled training of her cohort. And I was totally surprised when I saw her connecting herself, joining the class, and staying the whole time of the class. I was just so thankful for her determination to continue learning, even connected to oxygen. So in order to keep alive and vibrant, then this important component that we have at the Institute, the personal interactions, the CLLI offered prayer and support meetings for all our sites. We checked with them when was the best time. Some were meeting Thursday at 9 o'clock in the morning, other ones were meeting on Saturdays at different times. And during these meetings, the students were able to find support and nurture the relationships with each other. And also all the way to today, this started at the end of March, we have a prayer time that is every day at 10 a.m. or 10 p.m. at night. And we have a private group in Facebook and other groups in WhatsApp. And what we do, we post a verse there and we post a prayer concern. And a lot of the women join. So there's this connection there. And then they share their concerns, their prayer concerns, that there are a lot, and a lot of them related to COVID. So even though remote education is not the same as face-to-face education, I'm just so thankful that we continue to see great results and we strive to offer the same quality in all of our educational programs, but with different formats.
Ryan, you want to share with us about the ways y'all have adapted?
Sure, yeah. That online program that I talked to you about that started in 2002, it had pretty much became, with how just our students voted with their feet, became about 2/3 of the classes that we taught now became online classes. So our Pasadena campus was, in a sense, dwarfed by 2020 or 2019 as far as online. So as the online part we were prepared for. Our School of Psychology was not prepared for that at all. So that was a huge transition for them to go online. Most of the other professors of the other two schools had taught online. Those who haven't quickly learned. I think for us, what we did as a faculty was we, beginning in the spring quarter, we allowed students to, we were really flexible with due dates. We were ready to pray with students. Usually when a student asks for an extension on a paper or there's some issue, it's more of a perfunctory email request sort of thing. But in this situation, professors, and this is what I did, was how are you doing? And praying with them online through email, and allowing them to really be very generous with due dates. I almost didn't care when they turned it in as long as they got it in by the end of the quarter, knowing that every week was just so tumultuous. We also, as a faculty, decided that if a student needed to change the topic of a final paper, regardless of the class, systematics, Bible, contemporary culture, that if the events of the day in the culture were troubling, or you just needed to wrestle with those issues, we were willing to just change the topic of the final paper for you. So they did that. And so students wrote about the difficulty in their church when they, let's say they were African American and everyone was wanting them to be a spokesman for all African American people. And so they were in conversations nonstop and they didn't sign up for that. And so, or, you know, so everyone is, we have many students writing all sorts of different papers on their, from their heart. And so that was really healthy. We addressed those sorts of issues in chapel. I think for us as a faculty, we'd been moving this way. For about a year or two, we've been talking about white normativity in our classes, in our admin, in our staff, in our presuppositions, also more of a patriarchal view, and that's implicit in so much of what we were doing. And so we as a faculty had been making the change to move from let's get diverse readings, let's make, add a diverse author to a course, to let's rethink our courses and begin with many, many diverse voices. And there's no normative, there's not the normative and the diverse, it's all diverse. And so we've been making those changes as a faculty and looking for that not only to hit our curriculum and our syllabus, but we're actually from the bottom up rethinking our degrees and redesigning our degrees. That's our faculty. We started over in the fall, and as a faculty, we are redesigning all our degrees for next fall, which if you know faculties, we're used to doing things 7 years out. And so and that's all related to COVID. I mean, it's COVID, but it's Black Lives Matter. It's the elections. It's everything that's gone on in the culture has realized that we need to be a different kind of school, a different kind of faculty for a different kind of church that's required going forward. And so we actually have rethought all staff, all admin, all senior leadership, everything sort of redesigning. And we're a change-averse people. I mean, I don't know any faculty member that went in. I've never heard someone say, I came in here because I love change. So we like to find our little niche in the New Testament and then just study that for years and years. And so for us to sort of bottom up change the whole thing, be based on just this new era that we're going into, has been amazing. I've been a part of a lot of change efforts over the last 18 years at my school. Honestly, most of them have failed. We just didn't have the tipping point. This time it took. For the last 6 months, our lives as professors have been crazy. Usually it's, let's meet monthly and we'll talk about it the next month and the next month and then summer. And then we're on sabbatical, and then we're meeting weekly to redesign many meetings, and we've actually never worked together so much as a faculty as we are now. And we have never seen each other as much as we are now through Zoom calls. So that's sort of our engagement with this whole time and era. It's exciting, it's exhausting, but it's been, we're very optimistic about how we might serve the church as we move forward into the future.
Thank you. I do have a question that has been submitted by one of our professors, Dr. David May, and he says, thank you for being with us today and your sharing. I have a question related to training and teaching of millennials. I understand some of the different pedagogies needed for this group, but what type of strategies are used to recruit the millennials, especially those who are labeled as nuns? Since the nuns are the largest growing denomination, and that was denomination in air quotes, some nuns have suspicion about institutions. How might one appeal to this group to join with the seminary community and what it has to offer? And that may be directed at you, Dr. Bolger. So.
Yeah, that's the challenge of the day, or one of our big challenges of the day. I think a seminary that it gives them what they need when they need it. I think a seminary that will really give them some say in sort of the overall design of what they're doing. They may need particular skills at particular times, and being flexible. I know it's really tough because I've been part of. It's hard to create degrees that are flexible and accessible, and actually relevant to their context today. It is very difficult, but I think those are some of the things we'd have to be doing. That we have to remember that for many communities, not just millennials, but across all communities, there's a move towards holism, and so an everyday a program that talks about their own calling in an everyday spirituality that would make a difference in their workplace, in a difference of how they spend their money, in a difference of how they spend their spiritual lives, in a different way that they would treat the environment. It needs to be a very holistic sort of way. I think a seminary that is very diverse and very open, very engaged. It does not see them as insular from the political, from the social, from the economic. I think, not that I can speak for millennials, but in some of our research and what we were thinking as far as what we're doing, those are some of the practices we want to put in place for us to connect to and train millennial leaders.
If I might, this is Charisse. One of the things that we are doing here, just to not millennials or any student who is not quite sure that they are interested and that they have been called to the kind of institution we are. We make it easy for them to audit a course. We make it almost seamless for them to take a course on Thomas Merton, or for them to take a course on the implications of climate change, so that they get a sense of what kind of institution we are. They get a sense of how we're teaching in terms of the online environment. They get a sense of the conversations. And they also have a chance to kind of unpack their own curiosity about a subject and explore their call, because that's why they're coming to us. So we try to find maybe 4 courses a year where we advertise those courses with the intent of attracting individuals who might not normally think about LTS. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't work, but it's a strategy for allowing someone who's in an exploration phase to explore, to be committed to the one course, explore their own spirit and thinking about taking that course, and then to ask more questions as they journey with us.
Well, as we are sitting here on a Zoom call, I don't know if you're aware of what's going on in our world right now, but the
Yes.
U.S. Capitol is under lockdown. Protesters have broken through, and tear gas and evacuation have happened. So in the midst of a conversation about the religious landscape changing and adjusting to cultural changes, we sit in a time that they're just really hard. It's hard for me to put into words of the difficulty of these last days of our political world, and how do we as seminaries provide leadership and comfort and guidance to those in our community and our students. And well, that's kind of sitting heavy with me in the last few minutes as I've received several texts about what's happening right now. And I know that all 3 of you have provided leadership in hard times. And I'm wondering kind of where you are in your head right now and thinking about this conversation we're having, and then the reality of what's happening in these very moments in our capital.
In 2018, I believe, I applied for a grant from Leadership Education at Duke Divinity. And it was their reflective leadership program. And so so I applied for it and I received the funding. It was a generous grant. And my period of reflection was to think about and reflect upon what it meant to lead in crisis and what it meant to lead in periods of stability. So laugh right now, chuckle right now.
Yeah, when do we get to that stability period? I'm just wondering about that one.
There hasn't been any stability in 2019 or 2020, which is when the grant was being implemented. So as I have thought about that, I have just really come to a place of saying to myself that I need a really, really deep toolkit. I need to know a lot about a lot of different things. I can target a subject matter, for administration, if that's what we're going to talk about. But in order to be an effective leader, period, I just need to know how to work with people, collaborate with people, identify good ideas, ask good questions, listen better, be authentic about who I am. And then to acknowledge, I think, in a setting like this, what you just did, which is to say, this is a tough moment for us. How do we move through it? And just seek the wisdom of the community. So I have been chuckling since 2018 about this leading from crisis to stability. It's lead and put a lot of different things in your toolkit so that you can lead. And when you don't have the right tool in the toolkit, ask and just seek the wisdom of the community and don't be afraid to lead. Leaders look like come in all variety, shapes, sizes, languages, from all kinds of backgrounds. And I'm just beginning to think the good ones listen well, ask the right questions, and are committed to their own growth. So in this moment, I saw it on my phone. They said the Capitol had been stormed and they were closing the Capitol. And I thought, how can this be? What can we do as religious leaders and leaders in academic institutions? We have got to help our country reset the table. We have to help people reset the table. Truth matters. Faith matters. Trusting institutions matter. Not that they're perfect. We have to, as educators and people of faith, help reset this table in our own context. So that's kind of where I am right now, chuckling a little bit about my crisis to stability, but thinking the work to be done is the work of resetting the table.
I'm thinking right now, following the words that Dr. Gillett was sharing about leading by example, which is very hard, and trying to discern, because there are students who are looking at us to see how we're going to react right now to this particular moment, what we're going to say, what we're not going to say. So discernment, I think, becomes very, very important, I think, as leaders, because people are observing. So discernment from God to know how to act, how to speak, how to listen, all these actions and characteristics that Dr. Gillett was mentioning before. But we need to live that. We need to live by example.
I think I'm realizing in the classes that we're teaching is that these sorts of issues that are right at the center of American politics and life and congregations are, they can form the topic or some of the background topics of any class that we teach. If it's New Testament, if it's systematics, if it's culture, we can bring up these issues, not as extra issues, but what's a theological take on this? What does the New Testament talk about with race, and what are our cultural sorts of situations? What are we in terms of preaching? And so all these issues can be areas of reading. I've noticed that students that may come from a different perspective than me, if I give reading and give open type of discussions, and I create journals and different sorts of small groups in the classroom, the students appreciate, and this is online now, all online, the opportunity to investigate these issues away from their congregation, away from their families, and really look at some of these things. And I've really seen some amazing epiphanies happen among students in regards to just having a broader perspective of what's going on out here. I think that's a way we may serve the church, is training leaders who are well-versed in sort of just in a broader biblical theological perspective of what we're going through. And it's not a stretch to rethink our disciplines. We may have just thought that, okay, New Testament 1 covers X, Y, and Z, but actually we can be very flexible with the kind of things that we're teaching in our classes and what we're covering. And so, and especially in terms of projects and assignments. And so that's one way I am looking to serve the broader church and the issues that we're engaging, is opening up that space to for papers, reflection, readings from very thoughtful Christians on these topics. So, a very difficult time. Yeah.
Charisse, earlier you'd mentioned a course on preaching the purple pew, or maybe I got
It's preaching in the purple zone.
In the purple zone.
Yeah.
And I know that all of the students that we are involved and connected to our communities live this out every day in their congregations and in their ministries. They're being asked questions, and they're struggling. And one of the challenges I think in leadership too is to be vulnerable enough to say, this is really hard, and it's hard for me, and I don't have all the answers, but I'm certainly wanting to have conversations with you about this and to talk to you about that. And that's kind of been my fallback in this season of, I don't have all the answers to this. We've never lived in a time quite like this before, where so many different points of chaos have converged to shake our world. And, how do we as individuals deal with this? I've struggled with that. And then how do I lead in the midst of this? So I appreciate your good words and encouragement along the way, that this is really hard.
Yeah.
It's a hard season.
It's very.
So, I'm wondering if anyone in our audience has other questions that they might like to ask. If you put those in the Q&A or in the comments on Facebook. Then I have one other question that I'll throw out and just to see as we wait. How are you training your students? How has this pandemic shaped the ways that you are preparing them in class and talking to them about how they lead in their congregations and lead nonprofits? What are some things that you see coming out of this learnings that we are developing in this season that will help us do a better job preparing students and ministers for real life ministry?
Well, I'll jump in. One opportunity that we have that we feel like we've been given because of this is that people are not leaving their context. They're staying, and often our students are already pastoring, but they just never received a degree, or they're doing some sort of leadership, and they're in their context. And so we've really talked about our faculty shifting our focus of come to us and we'll train you, to we'll come alongside you and work with you. And so as you are ministering in your context, so we can give assignments now that they're in their context. They're not abstract assignments that someday you might encounter this, but actually do this in your context, or try this in your context, or what's your context like now? And so we can shift our assignments to assume they're in their world and in their home and in their neighborhoods, as opposed to we've brought them away. They're a stranger in our town, and they're a visitor and a guest for a couple years, but actually they're with their most significant others. Maybe they're in their hometown, they're in their place which is employing them. And so we can ask them to try this at your workplace. And so for me, I teach on spiritual practices. I can have them practice spirituality, breaking bread with others in their workplace, having conversations, praying, doing the daily office or prayers every half hour or 3 hours or 5 during the day, even in their secular sorts of contexts, or in the midst of their many things that they do. So I think that's a shift for us, and an opportunity is to be with them in their difficult contexts, as opposed to they've left their difficult context and have come to us. So I think that's an opportunity that's happened because of all this.
For LTS, because our students are in an accountable ministry site through the life cycle of their degree program, the assignments are built in to include what's going on in their ministry context. I think where we have, and we've made our faculty have made some adaptations in that vein. What we're learning are two things, I think. For me, it's kind of too early to say, here's what we've learned. So here's what we've experienced. Students have been very resilient and creative about the use of technology. Many students, because of the online context for us, as part of the teaching, they had a familiarity and comfort with technology. But now they have to use technology to do pastoral visits, and technology to do communion, and technology to hold prayer meetings and so forth. So I think they've just been very creative with the use of technology. The other thing that I think we are learning and are able to help our students with, we've had a focus on pastoral well-being. And so when our students are in class, they're a part of a covenant group. They have to take a covenant group where maybe 5 or 6 students are in that class. It's led by a faculty member. And that's where they get a chance to really talk about what's impacting their pastoral life. More often than not, it's what's impacting your life. And so what we found was that because we had that built into the curriculum, students really wanted to continue that kind of connectivity. So we developed pastoral peer groups for when they graduate. And so for about a year, every student can volunteer to be a part of a pastoral peer group or a pastoral covenant group. And that one piece alone, allowing them to convene with their colleagues, over coffee, if it's Zoom, has really, I think, built some pastoral resilience in them, and giving them tools so that they can continue in their ministry. So for me, those are the two things that we are experiencing now. I think it will take us a little bit longer to say, we did this, and as a consequence of that, we have learned this. Some of that's emerging in our strategic planning process, but there's a little bit more, I think, time. So we can capture the moment, respond to the moment, but I'm not sure we can say what we've learned and what that really means for us today.
I think one of the things you said has reminded me, one of our alumni has written about how in this season he's depended on his fellow graduates to help him, and they have reached out to each other and shared things they've learned about using technology in worship and how to do just some of the technical things. And I've seen some of that connection between students who've been gone for 5, 10, 15 years who are learning from each other
Mhm.
because they need each other, and they're so willing to share what they're learning. Some of it's very technical, and some of it is more philosophical and pastoral. So I think that's a gift too. Of we depend on each other a little bit more now, and not even though we're more isolated physically, we are much more connected virtually.
Let me just mention something regarding that question. For me, I agree that it is too early to say, what we learn and the directions that we're going. But I think, and I agree when it was mentioned that change is hard. But I see the challenges of this pandemic that they have turned to be opportunities. Like, for instance, right now at the CLLI, the academic committee is evaluating all the existent formats that we have to offer our trainings. My hope is that the new skills that we have developed regarding the use of technology and remote education will continue with us as we launch trainings in hybrid models. Face-to-face is very important, but also online and virtual platforms allow us to get to more places, to be careful and good stewards of our human resources and our financial resources. So yeah, this last spring, the world changed completely right before our eyes, and we had to adapt. Educational institutions and students, we had to change to continue learning. But the fact that we were able to adapt, it is a blessing, not only for the educational institution or the educational work, but I think it has made us better leaders. It has opened opportunities to continue dreaming about bigger things, not only in our educational efforts, but in our lives and ministries. If you overcome one obstacle in one area of your life, you are more empowered to overcome other things in your life. If you did it once, you can do it again and again. So thanks be to God for this opportunity, for these challenges that have turned into opportunities of being better.
We do have one other question from one of our board members, Jan Hawkins-Smith, who asked, have any of your seminaries or schools developed courses for lay people to help support their pastor to move toward the changes that need to occur? Oh.
In our Thriving Congregations Initiative and in our Thriving in Ministry Initiative, we have component parts for our lay leaders as well. So for the Thriving Congregations Initiative, it's the pastor, a deacon, and an elder, and a lay leader who may or may not have title. In our Thriving in Ministry, it's any member of the laity that wants to participate in our webinars, workshops, classes. We have parallel programming for them, primarily because it's pastor and congregant that will make it work. So we've done that, and I think we've seen some good results.
We have a whole set of curricula that's for that's non-degree, that is more like 4 or 5 classes, self-paced, around all sorts of areas of ministry, and sort of really designed for congregants and those people who just don't see themselves in seminary. But as far as the events of today and what's going on now, I'm not sure we've responded in that sort of way yet as far as any sort of training. And so, yeah, I can't say that we have our professors are creating all sorts of materials for lay people. But as far as, and I could just be out of the loop on this, I'm not sure aware of any professor who's designed something for congregants along the things that we're looking at right now.
Well, our time is just about up. We've taken our entire hour and a half. And I appreciate so much the 3 of you joining in this conversation and sharing about your ministries and leadership. about the work that you're doing with students and the ways in which you're joining God and God's good work in this world. This has been good for me to hear, reassuring in many ways on this hard day, but also it's been a joy just to get to know some colleagues who are walking in this same journey with me. And I know that our audience has appreciated you very much. So I've just got a note in the chat from Larry Cornine, one of our faculty. He said, thank you very much, very informative. So this has been a good day to have conversation, and I appreciate you joining in Inauguration Week. Yeah. And just as an announcement, the inauguration service is actually tomorrow night, Thursday night at 7 p.m. Central Time. It'll be on Zoom and on Facebook Live, and you can join us. It was all filmed, and so it's in safe environments, and I'll be at home watching it on the sofa with my family. So it's a different kind of inauguration, but it's very much appropriate to the season. But thank you so much, all three of you, for joining us, and look forward to future conversations with you.
Good
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Blessings.
Thank you.